Shall we begin then? My name is Harold Nelson, and I'm going to be the guide and navigator for this masterclass and for several subsequent masterclasses in systemic design. If you need or would like to have more information on my background and resources that I've collected over time, I invite you to visit my website, www.haroldgnelson.com. And there's a lot more material there and links to articles, videos, books, etc. So, as an introduction to the classes and to their structure and process, the design of the classes are systemic and they're inclusive, multi-layered, and are not comprehensive. That means that they're introductory and that they're non-reductive, synthetic as well as analytic, that they're very broad and inclusive and have a deep and complex approach. The success of the course depends as much upon your state of reception as it does on the content of the course itself. So this is an example of kind of introductory piece about the different states of listening we can be in whenever we're introduced to new information. And the norm, the one that we're typically in, is that we're listening for something that affirms what we already know. So it's reconfirming to us and it's familiar. If we want to learn something new and we want to sort of be open to new ideas, we want to be at another state that would be, for instance, critical, would be disconfirming to what we already know. And we can further open up to where we're actually listening for the other, about the other, and on behalf of the other. Anyway, this is just a sort of introduction to the notion that we can imagine ourselves to be in these different states of listening. And the success of what we learn or what we hear depends as much on the state that we're in actually, and as much as it is what the content of the material is. So you're a major part of this whole presentation. It's not just me, just the course itself. So presently, there's a lot of time and energy being spent escaping issues, problems, threats, etc. in today's world. But we're not spending enough time creating desired futures that we want to see be made real. So if we're going to change this, how do we approach that kind of a change, a major change? And one of the ways is by thinking different and, of course, by design. So the intention of the courses and master classes is to explore how to establish a place where we can begin to explore the nature and the challenges of systemic design and how we can sort of begin to think about how we can learn, get better at being systemic designers, how we can understand what systemic design is about, and how we understand how we work together to come to common understandings and build common backgrounds in it. So part of the common background is to understand um, in this shared space that we're going to build for having a conversation about systemic design is to talk about and discuss what systemic design has been, what it is, what it can be, what we desire it to be. And these classes, master classes, are meant to be catalysts for helping to form a common platform then that will give us a place and a space for our conversations that we have together, collective conversations around the nature of systemic designing and how it's applied, how we can practice systemic designing. So this course and the subsequent master classes are going to be introducing ideas and concepts that are going to be part of the conversational mix that we have together when we're talking about designers and systemic designing. They're going to be a part of the mix. They're not the whole mix. They're just going to be contributions to the conversation. And they're not meant to be by any means the sort of bottom line answers to any questions that there may be about what systemic designers do and how they become systemic designers, what systemic design praxis is like. It's just meant, these courses are just meant to become a part of the mix, to present just an aspect of some of the background and sort of common ground that the conversations will be based on. So, conversations that we'll have and the ideas that are going to be presented, in part, is going to be because they're systemic. They're going to be part about how we see complexity, how we can look at things, ideas, concepts, realities that are quite complex. But the thing about complexity is that we cannot see it from one position, one station point, one sort of visual perspective. And what we do get is maybe glimpses of parts of the complexity. And this sort of plays off the idea of Plato and his shadows on the wall in a cave, where the people in the cave can't see outside, but they see the shadows cast on the walls of the cave of the exterior world. And so in a way, this is just saying that we're not going to be able to observe any complete concept, idea, approach in its totality from any one place, any one perspective, from any one viewpoint. It's that we have to walk around through and see all the different aspects of the ideas that we're going to be working with, and to be able to begin to comprehend how all of these parts begin to feed one another and become more of a composition, a holistic composition taken together. But we're not going to be presenting, I'm not going to be presenting ideas and concepts that give you the whole picture just from one perspective or one viewpoint. So, why it's time? We've been sort of through some traumatic changes in the last few years, and some even before that, but certainly last few years have challenged a lot of the norms that we've held, and a lot of the norms have changed. Some of them had to change. It's been a good idea to sort of begin to build new norms. And part of that is to begin to look at the world and our interaction with the world more as designers, especially as systemic designers. So the reason is that the way we've been doing things, the way we've been thinking about the world, the way we've been thinking about change and intervention isn't working so well. And the expectations that people have of professionals, particularly designers, systemic designers, is that we're going to do better and we need to do better. So this is one of the major reasons now that we really need to begin to look at systemic design with fresh eyes, and that by collectively having these conversations together, looking into ideas and building on one another's notions, that we can get a much better understanding of what we can do, what we should do, and how we can do it. So the idea for these conversations is sort of a follow-on to my experience, other people's experiences with something that I call a bubble. And from the early 1960s, continuing into the 1980s, there was an aggregation of exceptional scholars and professionals that formed in the University of California, Berkeley environs, and they established a common bond amongst themselves and with other networks of scholars, students, and professionals globally. They were not from the same disciplines, or specializations or professional fields. And what they were colleagues who were sharing a common aspiration. And what they shared was a deep interest in and a commitment to the utility of systems thinking and design action as a means to secure improvement and advancement in the human condition. And this common bond resulted in the Berkeley bubble, what I call the Berkeley bubble. And it has been internationally influential inside and outside of academia. So these are sort of a continuation of some of the ideas that came up during the Berkeley bubble's tenure, and continuing some of the conversations with some of the major ideas, still with this notion of trying to secure improvement and progress in the human condition. So one of the things that we need to do is to begin to build the sort of distinctions and conjunctions that will make a difference in the conversations that we have. We have to have a better understanding of what different meanings are that we're bringing, what different understandings we're bringing, and to discover the things that we have in common. So, for instance, when you read an article about design or you listen to somebody talking about design, invariably they will have assumed that design, as they're using the term, is representative of a particular field. And trust me, this is a listing of some design fields. And there are many, many more, and more coming on all the time. And essentially, what these fields are they are tactical approaches to design. They're what people would call disciplines, design disciplines. And one of the first things we need to understand when we're talking with one another is what particular field are we assuming that design represents. And in addition to that, there's this notion of strategically, when we're talking about design, there are assumptions that people make as well, so that some people will talk about design, have talked about design, still do, as a midpoint between science and arts and humanities. And for instance, my training, original training as a designer, was in architecture. And what we were told in school was that architecture was a midpoint between science and the arts and the humanities. And they made us take classes then at university in both science and art. And interestingly enough, I'm not sure if they still do it or not, but Stanford, in order for you to get a degree in design, you had to have a degree in science and a degree in fine arts. And there was no sort of specialization of a course for designers from science. You had to have actually courses in solid science, and the same way for the arts. Another one, more popular here in the last decade or so, came from Apple and Steve Jobs' business organization. And that was that Jobs said design was this intersection between technology and the arts and the humanities. And you're probably all familiar with his story that he took a course in calligraphy, and that made sort of all the difference in the world when he started working with computers and designing computers. So that there was this notion, this influence of the arts on the technology that he was working with. So there was a rather well-known professor who in 1959, I think, gave a lecture at University of Cambridge, the Reed Lecture. And at that lecture, he stated that there were these two cultures of inquiry that were so different, so distinct, that they would never, ever be able to talk to one another or have any kind of common ground or kind of common background. So he made a distinction between science as a culture of inquiry and arts and humanities as a totally different kind of culture of inquiry. And he published a book from that lecture, and it's proven to be controversial since he first presented the ideas in '59. They still inform a lot of debate in that. But anyhow, the point here is that we can imagine that design is a third culture of inquiry. Now, that's not commonly accepted or understood, but a case can certainly be made that design is its own culture of inquiry. It has its own postulates, its own assertions, its own traditions. It has all of the sort of components of a design of a inquiry that fits the same kind of approach as C.P. Snowes was making the case for science and the arts. The thinking, though, is that design actually is inclusive of aspects of science and inclusive of aspects of arts and humanities, that design is rational and disciplined, as well as very creative and open, so that it has parts of both of those other traditions. So essentially, make the case that design is a multicultural inquiry, so that in design inquiry, what we want to find out is what's true, which is scientific research, what's real, it's more again to what system science does in its research, and what's good, humanities inquiry, what's right, humanities again, what's aesthetic, arts, and what would be ideal, and that's design inquiry, what would be prudent, design inquiry again, what would be desirable, design inquiry, and most importantly, what ought to be made real. Design inquiry again. So design inquiry isn't a distinct sort of approach to inquiry. It is a multicultural inquiry, and that means that it has the notion of part of what it does, it determines what's real. That's the assessment approach to inquiry, and it's context dependent. And the other, or another aspect is what's true. And of course, that's research, scientific research, very much context independent. It means that we come up with things that are universally true and will stay true, stable over time, location, that it's fairly constant. The other one is that we want to find out what's ideal, what's aesthetic, what's good. We engage in search, and it's part of an intentional form of inquiry. And finally, the fourth one is that we want to understand and find out what's prudent, ethical, and right, which is in part reflection and action, and wise action. Comes from intention, what's the outcome? That's what we're interested in. So that's a multicultural inquiry, which we can say that's what systemic design inquiry is, multicultural inquiry. So culture has a variety of understandings that people assume, and the one that we've just been through, making the case for design of inquiry as a form of culture. And culture is defined by its artifacts of creative activity. It also, culture can be a character of a living system, and it can be the actual design of a social system. It can be considered as an emergent quality, or the aggregate norms and habits, beliefs, values, and customs of people, or it can be tied to geography. And of course, there are other understandings of culture as well. But the one that we talked about and that we're going to be exploring quite a bit is this notion of culture is a design of inquiry, how we go about engaging in discovering what's real, what's true, what's ideal, and what's prudent. So one of the interesting things looking at design as a culture of inquiry is that there's this notion of culture shock, and it may be something that you've experienced before if you've made a transition from one culture into another. So if you move to another country or another region in the world, and you've gone into a culture that's quite different from your own that you had grown up with. Or if you are immersed into a different culture, for instance, if you've gone to visit to do some scholarship, or if you want to do some consulting or something, and you're immersed in a different culture, then you can often experience what's called culture shock. And we won't go into the steps in detail, but there are several steps of reaction that you will experience. And I've done that myself, gone through those steps to my surprise. They're sort of real. So anyway, to imagine you coming from whatever cultural background you have as a form of inquiry. So if you're a scientist, or if you're an artist, or if you're a musician, or if you're an author or literature, then you want to experience systemic design as a culture. If you want to move into it, or you just want to immerse yourself into it, you can imagine that you're going to experience some form of culture shock. as you go into it. And it's not that that's a negative thing. It's just the reality of moving from one culture into another, whether it's a transition or an immersion. And there are different kinds of cultures that appear in design itself. There's the culture of designing, the actors, the individuals, the teams, the cohorts that are all part of the agents of designing. And then there's the design-friendly culture, the space that you are in as a designer, which is a kind of a container or crucible. And it includes the champions and protectors of what you're doing, what the design process is about, who you are as a designer, what you need to do. And the other one is that it's the cultural station point, the place, the perspective, the stance you have, the position you're in. So those are like three different kinds of cultures that exist in design culture itself. Three different just types. Excuse me. And the place is, of course, what we're trying to do here is to develop a place, a station point that we can all together have conversations in, and that we can have discussions in, and we can do some experiential learning and have some applications, so that the culture becomes then our place for a conversation, our space for conversation. And to begin to pull in, identify the champions who support us and the alliances that we need to be in order for systems design to be successful. And then, of course, how do we develop the actors? How do we create, just for ourselves and for others, how do we create competent systemic designers that can work together in teams and cohorts and can actually be a part of a design process, working for clients and stakeholders and others. So here in systemic design, one of the reasons that we speak of systemics and design together is that systemics are the logics of design. There's a lot more to design, of course. There's aspects, aesthetics, and ethics and other things. But most importantly, in this case, systemics are the logics of design. And that any progress in system science and other fields really add to the credibility of what designers are doing, and particularly systemic designers. And you can't actually split systemics from design. It's sort of like physicists cannot split matter from energy. They're combined. They're a combination. And thus, in this case, systemics and design are also combined. You can't separate them. It doesn't make sense to talk about design and not talk about systemics. So systemic designing, in this case, it's not, I guess, so well known with people, but there's this notion that in designing, you're actually bringing something into existence that didn't exist before, which is why the usual traditions of inquiry for describing and explaining something aren't necessarily sufficient in this case, but because when you bring something into existence, you're making it, and you're not explaining or describing it as you would in science, for instance, but you're actually creating something. You're creating reality. So that's poiesis. The other is that poiesis is in conjunction with what's called phronesis, which is wise action. And it's a type of wisdom that's practical or prudent action, and it shows good judgment and excellent sort of character. Now, both of these terms aren't necessarily like big words or any or academic words or anything. They're just words for things that we don't talk about that much, that aren't so common, and that need to become more common and become more part of our conversation in order to help us understand more clearly what systemic designing is about. So these aren't just two different aspects, they're actually conjunctions of one another. So it's making and taking wise action in combination. So we can say systemic design is a form of inquiry. It's thinking differently when set against a different world of background practices and trainment. And that means it's a hard concept to understand immediately because it deals with things that aren't necessarily so apparent that we just assume. It's sort of like fish in water is an example that's used all the time. Fish don't understand or even see water. They don't understand that they're wet and what wetness means or anything. They're entrained in water, and so they can't see it. So systemic design is sort of entrained in a similar sort of element like water, like wetness, in that it's something that surrounds us and it provides a kind of reality and meaning for what we're doing. And paradigms, if we think of this entrainment from that water fish analogy, if we think of paradigms, paradigms are a form of swimming. So we are assuming that we're in this, whatever the media is, the water. We assume we're in this water. We don't question it. It's just there. And our paradigms allow us to successfully navigate and maneuver through that. And so paradigms are just a different way of swimming in the larger sort of entrainment of the water or the liquids that we're in, the background that we're in. So part of the specifications for putting these master classes together, performance specifications, is that they need to be inclusive, complex, and holistic, so that the courses and systemic design itself needs to include broad design. It needs to not be narrowed, siloed, be brought into particular slices, silos of reality. And we need it to be complex and deep. And complex doesn't mean just complicated. Certainly, it doesn't mean just that there's a number of pieces and parts and there's a whole bunch of stuff. Complex is very different. And it can be that we have to understand it as layered and it's in different sort of states. And so that it's not just a simple piece of a bunch of parts that are sort of related, which happens a lot when people are talking about complexity, is they talk often about numbers and aggregations of things. And the notion that it's holistic, which is the systemic design piece that comes together, that it has an integrity of the aggregation itself, the way it's composed and brought together, that it's sufficient. It's not comprehensive. It just means that it's sufficient. It has its integrity. It has its own quality because of the nature of all the connections, interconnections, and relationships that are in place. So this is just kind of a general summary of what we've been talking about, that it has to be a process of the courses are a process of establishing the shared space for inquiry, and that we can develop common ground for our conversations and our work together, and that we can begin to understand what systemic design education is all about, what systemic design practices are all about, and how we go about preparing and practicing or engaging in practice as systemic designers. So the reason for these master classes, beyond the establishment of just the conversations, which is important in itself, is that eventually the point is to establish a formal venue, a center for advanced systemic design, and within that center, to establish a systemic design flight school. And the idea of using the term flight school comes from the actual sort of models that you use in flight training. If I don't know if any of you are, have your flight backgrounds, and if you actually fly planes, but flight schools have this great structure where they have a structure of ground school where you learn theory and you understand sort of the nature of the physics of flying, that sort of thing. And then you go through the notion of instrument instruction. You learn how to use tools and aids in flying. And then you also do simulations. So you go through simulation, you can simulate flight or flying, and then you actually have a process where you go with flight instructors who help coach you and make sort of advices as you're going along. And before you go out solo flying, you go through those different stages. So it's a great model because people often say, well, you know, I don't want to just sit around and learn a bunch of theory. I don't want to just do a bunch of reading. I want to do stuff. So the obvious thing is in systemic design and flying is that because you've had a weekend workshop or you've had a boot camp or something, nobody's going to give you a key to the jet because you've had that brief introduction. You're going to get the permission to fly because you've committed to and you've engaged with a sort of a multi-layered, complex process of becoming competent to become a flyer. And the intention is to be inclusive of other master classes as we're going along that are going to be guided and navigated by other scholar practitioners in systemic designing related topics. So there will be particular areas, people bringing in particular perspectives and approaches to different aspects of being systemic designers. So thank you for your time and attention. I appreciate your interest, and we'll be looking forward to your presence in this subsequent courses now that we're going to be offering in preparation for the development of the center and the flight school. And watch for the other scholar practitioners that are going to be making presentations as well and doing master classes. We're all going to become a part of that larger sort of notion of the center, and out of a certain group, then we will get those who can actually begin to help be the navigators, guides for the scholar practitioners, the systemic designers that are just becoming or just beginning to develop as professionals. So we'll actually be developing staff as well as potential students for further training. Thank you. Thank you very much.